Alright. Hey everyone. Today we're going to talk about one of the greatest movies ever made, Groundhog Day. And then I'm going to find a way to shoehorn D&D into it. Let's go. Hey everyone, Mark here. Today I want to talk to you about the movie Groundhog Day starring Bill Murray. And then we are going to pull it back to D&D. I promise we'll make the connection in a little bit. But I want to tell you a story about me and the movie Groundhog Day. So this is one of my favorite movies of all time, and I'm not alone in this. It is a well-loved movie. A bunch of people have seen it a lot of times. And I, at one point in my life, had watched this movie too many times, let's say. So most movies, I actually don't enjoy watching them more than a couple times. I feel like I've gotten what I'm going to from the movie, and repeat viewings don't really do much else for me. And this was something different. So this was an exception to that rule. And of course, there are a lot of quotable lines from the film, and I knew many of them. I didn't really have the film memorized, but I knew all of the scenes, of course, and I knew a lot of specific lines and how they fit together. So I could go through the movie and quote bits and pieces here and there to make it seem like I knew large portions of the film. So a friend of mine was doing a viewing of Groundhog Day for another friend of his who had never seen it. He was like, hey, do you want to come over and watch Groundhog Day? And I was like, well, I don't know. You might get annoyed with me. I could probably just spout it line for line through the entire movie. And he looked at me skeptically, and he said something along the lines of, there's no way you have the whole movie memorized. And I just kind of gave him a grin and said nothing. So I didn't actually have it memorized. But my friend didn't know that. And so we had about, I don't know, it was like a week or two between when we had this conversation and when we ended up watching the film. So because I was a college kid at the time and I had apparently nothing better to do with my life, I went back home and I started watching the movie over and over and over again. But I had a plan. I didn't want to actually memorize the whole movie. I didn't want to annoy my friends by going line for line. I wanted them to actually enjoy the film, but I wanted it to make it seem like I knew the entire movie. So this became a bit of a guessing game. I watched the first 10 or 15 minutes over and over and over, and then I practiced saying the lines along with the beginning of the movie until I did have it memorized, but it was only 10 or 15 minutes. And then I said to myself, all right, at what point, if I'm doing this with friends in the same room, watching the same movie as me, if I am going line for line with the movie, saying them as the characters say them, at what point are they going to go from being impressed to just being annoyed and tell me to shut up? That was what I was trying to figure out. And as it happens, I guessed that moment perfectly. So I remember the scene of the movie. I don't remember the specific line or exactly where it fell. And I didn't guess it perfectly in that I hadn't memorized a single word or line past that, but I guessed it to within about 30 seconds, where if I had kept going and they hadn't stopped me, I was going to stop being able to go line for line with the movie in about 30 seconds. So where I guessed they were done with me was exactly where it happened. And so it worked out really well. And to this day, unless those two friends are watching this video, they still think that I might know every single line from the movie. Because they asked me, like, do you have all of it memorized? And again, I played coy and I was just kind of like, I don't know. And probably they could figure out that I didn't actually have the whole movie memorized, but it was sort of still up in the air. There was that mystery around whether or not I actually knew the whole thing, because I didn't make it definitive that I didn't know it. So, how does this apply to D&D? Well, the title of the video is Groundhog Day and World Building. So, as you may have guessed, I'm going to apply that story I just told to world building in your D&D campaign. When you're creating a campaign as a dungeon master, you have a lot of decisions to make. And a lot of those decisions revolve around what areas of the world you're going to flesh out. What areas of the world are you going to leave up to the imagination? Are you not going to think about? Are you going to sketch out lightly but not really draw in the details? And what areas are you going to focus on and have a lot of detail on? Now, common wisdom suggests that anything related to the plot hooks you're going to be giving the players, the NPCs who are going to be showing up and conversing and engaging with the players on a regular basis. This is where a lot of your prep work and a lot of your attention should be. And I don't disagree with that. However, where to draw that line in a campaign is sometimes a tricky decision for a DM, because you want your world to feel alive. You want it to feel like there's other things going on outside of whatever your players are doing. The immersion can be a lot deeper when this happens. So let me tell you one more quick story, and then I think you'll start to see some of the connections with the one I told earlier. So I was running a campaign, and the early part of the campaign was set in Waterdeep. And of course, many players and DMs are familiar with Waterdeep, if for no other reason than recently Wizards of the Coast came out with Waterdeep Dragon Heist. So even if you're just getting into D&D pretty recently, one of the most recent adventures that they've come out with is set in this city. And it's a massive city, and it has lore stretching back decades, literally decades. And there are thousands, that is not an exaggeration, thousands of individual locations, buildings, taverns, streets, alleyways, corners, nooks and crannies, secret entrances, cabals, temples, towers. Anything you could imagine in this city has been fleshed out and given lore behind it. Now, for bringing Waterdeep to life, we're going to talk a little bit more about that when I do a video on Waterdeep Dragon Heist, the adventure that came out recently. But what I want to talk about today is bringing things to life in general in ways that trick your players into thinking that you've done more work than you really have. And I suppose tricking isn't the right word, because to a certain extent, they're in on it. They know that you, as a dungeon master, can't prep everything. But you also want to make it seem like the world is alive and there's a lot going on in it beyond what they're seeing. So again, Waterdeep, hundreds of different locales, if not thousands, that have lore behind it. And so when you're trying to prep this city, you really have a ton of decisions to make, much more so than either other cities in the Forgotten Realms, or if you're creating a homebrew city where you can sort of flesh out the details that are important to you. In Waterdeep, there are going to be dozens, hundreds, thousands of details that aren't important to you. So you have to kind of sift through the lore and backstory behind all this to pick out the elements that are important to you, that are important to your campaign, and that are going to be important to your players. So what I did was I took the city and I broke it into chunks. Now, it's convenient because they do this anyway for you. Waterdeep is broken into wards, and these are sort of the neighborhoods of the city, and they each have their own distinct characteristics. And within each of the wards, there are, again, hundreds and hundreds of buildings in each of these wards. However, what I did was anything that wasn't directly related to the campaign, I largely ignored. So if the players weren't going to be directly interacting with it, I would ignore it. But I knew at some point they were going to break off and find different locations, talk to different NPCs, go looking for something that I hadn't prepped. So in essence, what I wanted to do with the city was guess the point to which my players would explore the city beyond the specific plot hooks and NPCs that I gave to them over the course of our adventures. And to me, it felt a little bit like guessing the point at which my friends were going to get fed up with me and tell me to be quiet when we were watching Groundhog Day. And lastly, the goal felt somewhat similar as well, because what I was trying to do is find that point where they were going to go to, have a lot of details fleshed out to that point, but then do minimal, if any, prep work beyond that point, so that they had the sense of there's a lot more that we're not seeing that Mark has prepped. But I wanted to do that. I wanted to create that sense while doing as little prep as possible. Now, some of this is going to be very subjective. It's going to be guesswork, and you're not going to always find the exact right point. Every DM who has run for long enough has multiple stories of the players going well beyond the confines of whatever they prepped for that particular session and having to make up everything on the fly. But going back to Waterdeep and the story that I was telling, in each of the wards, I would pick out 2 or 3 big locations. So these might be landmarks, they might be prominent places or inns or taverns, it might be a temple, it might be some other cultural hub, and I would learn a lot about those specific things. So if there was a storied past behind the Cliffwatch Inn, and there is, I could learn a bunch of those details, and if the players went to that ward of the city, I would filter them toward the Cliffwatch Inn for whatever they were looking for, or at least nearby, and it would be a chance for me to sort of do an exposition dump of these details as they passed by to flesh out the city in a way that maybe they weren't expecting. And this really came to fruition once. There were plenty of times in the campaign where I was able to pull these details into the campaign, where they said, "Okay, I want to go here and look for this thing," and I was able to sort of filter them toward a location that I knew some things about, that I wasn't improvising and making up on the fly. But one of the times where it really came to fruition, and I really had a lot of fun with it, was when they were racing around the city toward a certain location, and I started to describe the streets that they were going down. And you go on the street of the Singing Dolphin and make a right on this street. And it's been a couple years since I did this now, almost. And so I've forgotten all of the specific names. But if I needed to learn them again real quickly, right on my wall in this room is still my gigantic map of Waterdeep. So I could relearn them again in a hurry. But without looking at the map, I was describing the street names that they were going on. And one of my friends looked up at the wall and said, "Those are actually the street names that we're on." And he was flabbergasted that I was able to name them. And all it took was that little bit of prep work to have a detail that they didn't expect. So if we take these two stories, we try to meld them together and then come out with a general takeaway for world building in D&D, I think it's something like this. When you're world building, whether it's homebrew or a pre-established adventure, you don't have to prep every detail. You don't have to know every possible location that the players might go to. But I think it is very useful, and it can increase the immersion and thus the engagement of your players if you learn a handful of details in each location that you're going to be in that aren't strictly necessary for the adventure. And these details could be things like historical elements, it could be geographic notes, or you could just have names of NPCs in taverns and have them tell stories about what happened in the tavern, something like that. So maybe they go into a location and they meet an NPC, and the NPC just likes chatting and starts telling them about their life. All you need is a couple stories about what happened in the area, and it will start to feel like it's more alive. And these are things that add flavor. Not necessarily, you don't have to embed a plot hook in each of these stories or in each of these details. You can if you want. That's a nice way to have some crossover appeal with your prep work. But I think it's nice to have a handful of these that don't go anywhere, that are just there to help flesh out the world. Another trick along these lines with world building has to do with lying believably. So sometimes your players might ask you a question about a detail of the world and you don't have the answer. But oftentimes, the answer doesn't necessarily matter. You can answer one of many different things, and all of them are able to work within your campaign. So, as long as you look them in the eye and tell them the answer like you knew it all along, they will probably believe you. I think I saw this handled very believably in Critical Role one time, and many of you I know will be familiar with Critical Role. I don't watch it religiously, but I do enjoy it every now and then, and to mine it for ideas to pull into my own game. And one of the players asked Matt Mercer, the DM, and it was a joking question, like, what's the official flower of this city? And without skipping a beat, he looked back and he said, "Oh, yeah, the official flower is," and I forget what he said, but he had a flower name, and then he described the flower in detail, and he had a small historical note about why that flower was the official flower of the city. And the players all bought it. They were sitting there like, why in the world would you have prepped this? How can you know this? And you could see the looks in their eyes, like, how much has he prepped? The looks in their eyes when he said that little factoid about the flower was the same look my friends had when I did the first 15 minutes of Groundhog Day from memory. They were looking at me like, oh my goodness, how could you possibly know all this, and how much more is there in your mind that we don't know about? Now, I don't know for a fact that Mercer was making this up. I suspect he might have been improvising, and just improvising believably, because he's a trained actor and he's able to do these things on the fly a little bit more convincingly than many of us. And there was a slight hesitation, and you could see him thinking. And I'm not sure if he was thinking to recall it or if he was thinking to come up with it, come up with the idea from nowhere. But either way, once he started his delivery, it was incredibly believable, and you believed that he had prepped it beforehand. Whether or not he did, I don't know. And that's sort of the beauty of it. So if you can create the illusion that there's more beneath the surface of the game, your players will be more willing to go exploring in that world, to engage with that world. And their suspension of disbelief for certain elements will be much higher if they think that you've got it all planned out behind the scenes, whether or not you actually do. So that's all I have on this topic for today. Hopefully the link that I made between Groundhog Day and D&D wasn't too tenuous. Hopefully you can see where I was going with it. And hopefully you got a couple ideas on how you can enhance your world building to add little notes of detail to it that will really make it better for your players.